Good evening. A few of you will remember that in January, while Father Fred was still here, you'll remember we were privileged to host Ambassador Andrew Young here at Redeemer, and his topic was reconciliation. Well, fast forward a few months, and what a timely topic that we had for Ambassador Young. In fact, we thought his words were so good and so timely that we've decided to show again this evening his remarks that he made pre-COVID when the church was packed. I encourage you to listen with the ear of your heart, and to join me in prayer as we discern ways that this parish might be a voice of reconciliation in our community, in our church, in our world, and that we might speak clarity and peace and God's mercy and love and grace to a world that surely needs to hear it. So enjoy these words from Ambassador Young, and God bless you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to share what would have been the 91st birthday of my friend and brother Martin Luther King. And I couldn't have found a better place to do it or more company to share my particular views of the world in which we live at this time. Everybody who made it down here has been a success somewhere, or you couldn't afford to be here. And when I look at these first few rows, it's like a who's who of the civil rights movement. It's hard for me to start naming them, but you've got college presidents, ambassadors, heads of corporations, and most of all, and most important, their wives, that the reason they are successful is that they listen to their wives. But the wives too, in fact, the young lady who desegregated the University of Georgia, Charlene Hunter Galt, who really walked through the valley of the shadow of death and feared no evil, and has continued as a writer and throughout the world. Her husband came down from Wall Street to help us figure out how to develop Atlanta without raising taxes. The key to Atlanta's success is that we don't tax people for the progress and improvements. We learned that it's a whole lot easier to go to Wall Street than it is to go to Washington. And after all, Washington's in debt. Wall Street's got money they don't know what to do with. And so Atlanta has, we have thrived on the experience and the guidance of many of my friends that are here to see if I can address an audience like this without getting too rambunctious or without selling out. I've always been in the middle of the civil rights movement, and I had the reputation for being the Uncle Tom, because I was born in the middle of New Orleans, Louisiana, with an Irish grocery store on one corner, an Italian bar on another corner. The headquarters of the Nazi Party was on the third corner, and a Chevrolet dealership on around the fourth corner. And I lived right smack in the middle. So race relations for me started about the age of 4. And it has been a part of my life, and never very complicated, because I was blessed with good parents who, well, to sum it all up, said, "You're little." My daddy was 5'4". "You probably not gonna get more than 5, 6, or 7. You'll never be able to beat up everybody, so you don't need to start talking bad. And you can run, but you won't feel good about running from a challenge. The best thing for you to do is don't get mad, get smart. Don't ever get emotional in a fight or a struggle, because when you get emotional, it turns off your brain power, and the blood rushes to your head, and you'll do something stupid because your brain is not working. If you can stay calm and reason your way through the conflict, you'd be surprised at what could come into your head in the middle of a crisis. And it was a grandmother who was blind, who made me, without much difficulty, read the newspaper to her every day, and the Bible, and to listen to her fuss with God about everything that was going wrong, and pleading with him to take her on to heaven, because she had done her share and was ready to collect her reward. A couple of things about that. Reading the Bible and overcoming a fear of death. Looking forward to the possibilities of death. And living knowing that this is not all there is to our existence. But I'm preaching, and I'm not supposed to be preaching in the middle of the week. Let me just say that it really is a challenge to give any guidance about how we can achieve reconciliation of anything in the year 2020. Things have seldom been more polarized, according to all of the opinion present, practically. And yet I want to take us back to a time when they were even more polarized, and quickly try to help us see how we got through that. In 1962, there were 62 unsolved bombings of citizens' homes in and around Birmingham, Alabama. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth's church had been bombed 3 times over the last few years. And on December 17th, in 1962, it was bombed again. And his home right next door, the bomb fell in between. It didn't do a lot of damage to the church, but it knocked the pillars out from under the house, and the roof came crumbling down. And he was home. And everybody thought that Fred Shuttlesworth was gone. Many people would probably have been glad, because he was a very, very, very controversial sort of fellow. But he came out from under the smoke and ashes with a suit and tie on and brushed himself off and said, "They can't kill me. We're going to have to make this city come to Jesus." And he came over to Atlanta, and he didn't ask. He told Martin Luther King and me and the board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, "Look, nonviolence sounds good. I believe in it. But nonviolence does not mean sitting still and suffering needlessly and stupidly. You all have got to come to Birmingham and let's see what nonviolence can do with Bull Connor and George Wallace." Well, that was a death sentence. And immediately people said, "Oh, Lord, you better get out on your knees and pray, because some of us ain't going to make it out of there." And it was knowing that it was a march through the valley of the shadow of death to leave Atlanta and go to Birmingham, Alabama. I had just joined the staff and was a part of the United Church of Christ, and I was on a tax-exempt foundation grant. And so I really wasn't supposed to be going to jail and demonstrating and, and doing all the things that everybody else was doing. So I was sitting back relaxed, and Dr. King said, "Andy, don't you know some white folks in Birmingham, Alabama? You're supposed to be our authority on white folks." I said, "No, I don't believe I know." And he said, "Well, why don't you try to get to know some?" Well, lo and behold, I had met some nice white folks from Birmingham, Alabama. I met them in Michigan at an interdenominational youth conference with the National Council of Churches. And it happened to be the delegation from the Episcopal Diocese of Alabama. And there was a delegation there in 1959 or 60. And I remember that they were very, very impressive to be hustled out of a difficult segregated environment in Birmingham and Alabama and thrown into a multiracial international conference in Michigan. And I didn't remember anybody's name, but I knew it was the Diocese of Alabama. So I called and I said, "I'd like to speak to the director of Christian education." And I said, "Excuse me, ma'am, but I think I might have met you in Michigan a few years back. I don't remember, but do you remember, were you at a conference of a national conference of Christian youth work?" She said, "Yes, we had a good delegation." She said, "I remember you." And I said, "Look, I need to ask a favor. I need you to set up an appointment between your bishop and Martin Luther King." She said, "Well, I don't know Martin Luther King, and I don't think the bishop would want to meet Martin Luther King under the conditions that are going on now, but I know you, and why don't you come and meet with the bishop and see if you can get the bishop to meet with Martin Luther King? Well, actually, the bishop was glad. And all that you see in Birmingham, the fire hoses, the dogs, the bombings, the killings, nobody was killed during that period. The killing of the little girls occurred almost 6 months after those demonstrations had been completed. And but in the middle of all of the demonstrations, a total withdrawal of economic support from the system of segregation. In the meeting with Dr. King and Bishop Murray and Reverend Shuttlesworth and Abernathy, it was a nice gathering of business people and clergy. All the business people practically were white, and most of the clergy were black. But that sets the motion that led to the desegregation of America. And it didn't take but really that was in the beginning of January, and by right around Martin Luther King's birthday, we started. And by the end of May, 100 businessmen in Birmingham, Alabama, had agreed to desegregate their stores, to hire minorities of black women. Well, not hire new black women, but it was a simple matter of nobody blaming. And Martin had a beautiful way of saying, look, we're not here to blame you for being white, and we sure don't feel any blame for being black. This is the way we were born. But we were born black and white in an unjust relationship. Now, we can't do anything about the way we were born, but we can do something about the relationship. We can take an unjust relationship and bring justice to it. And we don't blame you for those signs on the wall that say colored and white. But we can't pay for colored and white water. And so as long as you have colored and white water, we can't spend our money here. And we don't mean you any harm, but it's an insult to us. And then we go up to buy something, and you have all some really nice people who come in here from Alabama and Auburn, and they work 6 months at a time or in the summertime, but they really don't know what's going on in the stores. And we have all these wonderful black women who have been there for 15, 20 years. And if you want to get something done in the store, you go to them. But they don't get a commission. And they have to give the sale to one of these kids that they're teaching about the business. And the business executives that had been gathered by Bishop Murray kind of had a hard time answering that. Their main answer was, well, they really aren't qualified. And we said, they know more about your stores than the regional director that comes in here every so often and may stay a year. And go home and ask your wife. When she wants something in Pizitz, which was the biggest department store there, who does she go to? She usually goes to a black woman who she's known since she was a child. And she knows what's going on, and your business is really being run by these black women. And all we're saying is, let them wear the dresses that they're selling, take off those stupid white smocks and give them a commission. It's not going to hurt anybody. And I don't think it'll make anybody mad. But at least let's say, we'll try it for 10 days and see what happens. And we, detail by detail, we went down all of the problems of segregation in the retail stores. And really, it was no problem at all. 100 businessmen eventually got together and they ended the boycott of Birmingham stores, and they desegregated Birmingham, even though it was still against the law, according to George Wallace and Bull Connor. But George Wallace may have been the governor, and Bull Connor was the sheriff, and I think mayor too at one time. But they didn't go against 100 businessmen. And when 100 businessmen decided that desegregation was that segregation was unprofitable, it ended. It actually ended a year and a half before the Congress got around to doing it. Now, I was telling this story in New York, and a little gentleman came up and said, "Excuse me, chap, I'm from South Africa. Harry Oppenheimer. You're Andrew Young. Very glad to meet you. Do you think 100 businessmen in South Africa could have the same impact on the South African government that 100 businessmen had in Birmingham?" I said, "Absolutely." And he said, "Would you come to South Africa and tell them that?" I said, "Sure." Well, in the meantime, things had moved along. We had changed the laws of the nation. I had gotten elected to Congress. Jimmy Carter had gotten elected president, and he'd made me ambassador to the United Nations. And so between the time that I met Harry Oppenheimer in New York and the time I got around to going to South Africa, things had changed a little bit. But nevertheless, the idea that 100 businessmen can change the politics, the economics, and deal with the moral issues of a community was just as valid. And Jimmy Carter, as president, actually, encouraged that. And again, it happened to be an Anglican bishop, Desmond Tutu, that ended up presiding over the whole mess in the first place. So your church, whether you like it or not, or whether you know about it or not, has been planting seeds all over the world that might just get you into heaven no matter where you've been and what you've done. So just consider what I'm saying is good news. And if we could deal with the conflicts of the 1960s in 2020, only God knows how we might come together, how we might reconcile rich and poor, black and white, young and old, and how we might find a way to learn, in Martin Luther King's words, to live together as brothers and sisters rather than perish together as fools. Now, you can clap. Now, that should be a good place to end. But I've come too far. And we have too far to go. But Jimmy Carter did that around the world. He was a Baptist, a commander in the United States Navy, selected by Admiral Rickover to lead as his deputy the establishment of a nuclear navy. And he probably knew more, and still knows, more about the death and destructive potential of nuclear warfare as all of the rest of our presidents put together. And when he was selected by Admiral Rickover, he was selected from over 500 of the brightest and best that the Navy had to offer. And yet they picked this peanut farmer from Plains. And he decides he's going to be president. Well, I mean, that was absolutely ridiculous. The Atlanta Journal and Constitution said, Jimmy is running for what? Question mark. We had absolutely no respect for a country boy from South Georgia. But he brought with him some of the lessons learned in race relations in South Georgia, because Sumter County happens to be 80% black. And he grew up as a white minority in Sumter County, Georgia. And he probably had more black friends and got along better with black people than he did with white people most of the time. Because he sure didn't get along with people up north. Just the Southern accent cast him aside as possibly ignorant. But he's the only president, the only politician I know that read every piece of paper, every bill that came across his desk. He read it from cover to cover. And he would put little stickums with little notes on it. So anytime you went to see him about everything. Now, I'd been to 50 countries in Africa before I went to the United Nations. And so I knew Africa, but I never had a meeting with him when he didn't know something I didn't know. And the same thing was true of everybody else. And still at 95, he reads everything, remembers it, makes notes, and in spite of brain cancer, he's still one of the sharpest minds I've ever been associated with. And he came up with something and didn't put a label on it. But to me, it was nonviolence translated into international politics. And it was what I call the politics of respect. And it's very, very simple. When I was nominated and appointed to the UN, he gave me a little note on just a little scrap of paper. I want you to go to Africa. I want you to ask African leaders what they expect of this administration and how we might help them. Well, I think that's probably the only time in history that any American president has asked anybody else's opinion from another country about what they would like us to do with them. Not for them, but with them. And the very fact that he flipped the switch on the relationship between us and the rest of the world was exactly what Martin Luther King did in Birmingham. It was exactly what makes nonviolence work. It's the mutual respect. You don't have to agree. After all, that's the only way any of us stay married. If marriage depended on agreement, we'd all be single. And you learn that two opinions is always better than one. And if it isn't bad enough dealing with your wife, wait till your children start getting to be teenagers. You can do nothing right. You are, well, you heard I got 4 kids grown, 9 grandchildren, mostly grown. But even the 8 and 10-year-olds find fault with anything Papa has to say. And that's exactly what you want. You want them to grow up thinking for themselves. You want them to have strong opinions. You want them to challenge your values as a way of developing their own. And so, unity and diversity are interdependent. And when we talk about reconciliation, we're not talking about everybody agreeing. We're talking about developing a civil style, which in its highest and best form is love. And if you love one another, you will listen to one another. And if you listen to one another, you'll be surprised how much you can learn from the persons you're living with and the persons who are that you're paying the rent for. Now, if all of this is true, and you can challenge me in a little while, it's not hopeless for the United States of America in the year 2020. There's no chance of agreement, but there is a chance of peaceful coexistence. And there is also a chance, and see, it's more difficult according to our Constitution because it requires a 60% majority to bring about change. And yet we were able to do it in the South with the Civil Rights Bill in the middle of constant violence and bloodshed. We were able to pass a Civil Rights Act in 1964 and a Voting Rights Act in 1965. And the truth of it is, we did not know what we were doing. We had plans that never worked, and we would argue about them, but the situation would always change, and we were always left to the grace and mercy of God. And that's the only hope for us in 2020. The grace and mercy of God can help keep this great nation united. Now, let me brag just a little bit, because we're kind of ahead of the curve in Atlanta. That politics almost doesn't matter in Atlanta. It's as vicious and nasty as it is everywhere else. But ultimately, because we go to Wall Street, Well, we don't need a 60% majority. You just need somebody running a balance sheet that's got more money. And they make money by placing money in places where they think they can get a return on investment. And you don't need a whole lot of agreement on that. In fact, there's actually competition between the Wall Street firms. When the city of Atlanta decided to build an airport and we were going to go to Wall Street, we probably had a half a dozen to a dozen on every bond issue we had. Everybody was there to get our tax-exempt municipal bonds. And I don't know what's so magic about them. I tried the whole time I was mayor. I knew before they were issued that they were going to be issued. And I thought that I ought to invest in at least one and frame it, just for old time's sake. I have never been able to buy one. And even if I could afford it, there were no more available, because that concept allows pension funds to invest their money and allows people to invest their money, their retirements, and not pay taxes on it. And when they cash it in and get 3 to 6% interest on it, they don't have to pay taxes on the interest. So it's a good deal. And that's what has helped Atlanta grow from a little less than 1 million people when I started out in the 60s to 6.5 million now. And the biggest problem we got is the traffic. But we were sure to share the wealth. And we were able to make sure that once we got those Wall Street investments, they were invested equally in diverse communities. It wasn't all going to the big silk stocking projects. It was going to a variety of things that would benefit all of God's children. Now, I don't get much agreement in Washington on that. And yet, as I got up to about 80, and people asked me, did I have a bucket list? I said, no, but there are some things that I probably ought to get right before I get to the pearly gates and get jacked up for my sins. And in a very simple conversation, he said, well, what is likely to be your bucket list? I said, well, the New Testament says when you get to the pearly gates, they're going to ask you, did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? Did you visit the sick? Did you set at liberty those who are oppressed? Did you proclaim the acceptable year of our Lord? And also there's a little thing in there about visiting those in prison. That turned out to be a pretty good agenda for a nonprofit foundation. We've been working on that. Feeding the hungry is very complex with global warming, with the shortage of water. We're not going to be able to grow food like we're growing it now. And so we've been experimenting with aquaponics, growing food and water, and along with fish. And instead of putting in chemical fertilizer, feed the fish, and the fish waste provides the nitrogen to make the vegetables grow fast. And so in our YMCA, we have our daycare center planting little seeds of lettuce and spinach and kale in the water. And in 4.5 weeks to 5 weeks, they can take home a head of lettuce that they have grown. They can take home a bunch of spinach. My daddy conned me into thinking about being Popeye to get me to eat spinach. But it's a whole lot easier if you grow it yourself and you take it home and you're proud of it. And even kale tastes good when you grow it yourself. Now, that's only part of the problem. When we got interested in this, I happened to go to Uganda. And there at the beginning of the Nile, this huge dam with generators that are 15 to 20 foot in diameter and 10 stories tall, were all choked by some little green leafy plant. And everybody was cussing it. This stuff, it shut down the electricity for the whole city of Kampala. And I happened to be a consultant for an engineering firm, and they were scared to go to Uganda. And so I took them to Uganda, and we went down into the dam, and they were cussing. And I said, God put this on earth for some purpose. We just haven't figured out what it is. And I go back to Louisiana, my daddy's hometown, and I find a guy with the same kind of little leafy plant cooking it in a moonshine still. Because it gives off 180 proof alcohol, which is, it's capable of being a jet fuel. So I said, what are you going to do with the ashes? And he said, I just scatter them on the plants. I said, can I have a bag? And I took a bag of the ashes from this green plant, sent it away. It turns out it's a 47.5% organic protein grown with no fertilizer. And it doubles its weight every 48 hours. And it contains all 18 essential amino acids. So we're trying to figure out how to grow it commercially. And it's not easy. But we've put a couple of $1 million into it. And we're getting and making progress. And it was important because when I came back to Atlanta, I was invited to speak to the Jain Society of Hinduism because they are advocates of nonviolence, and they know we learned a lot from Gandhi, and Gandhi learned from them. But the headline was, feed the cows and starve the children. And it was an attack on India's 1.5 billion population that is suffering because of a lack of protein. And so when you think about the world's population growing from 7 billion to 9 billion before some of us die, it's getting up there. It's going to be harder and harder to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and heal the sick. And so that's what we've been working on as a foundation. And we're continuing. And then I grew up on the Mississippi River. And every year it floods and people die. And they haven't done anything to fix the infrastructure in the Mississippi River since 1936. And there was something on CNN just the other day that the dams and the locks along the Mississippi River are all crumbling. 40% of America's trade comes down the Mississippi River. No, 40% of the world's trade comes down the Mississippi River. And we've neglected it, arguing about, because we're broken up into states, though there are 31 states that border along the Mississippi, they can't get together. We've organized the 88 cities between between New Orleans and Minneapolis. 70% of the cities along the Mississippi's tributary in Iowa flooded. But we had all these people running for president, and nobody ever said a word about the flood, except that back at Obama's time, the Republicans complained that he didn't send FEMA money fast enough. But their senator was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And they should have fixed it before you needed the FEMA funds. But we have so much that we have to do that is not hard if we can come together in Jesus' name and lay down our burdens down by the riverside and study war no more.